I am Bob Prichard. I am the vice president of the Middlesex County Museum and Historical Society, and had hoped to be at the museum for this presentation, but came down with COVID last week, and I just come out of COVID, I think, but I didn't want to go and infect other people at the museum. So, yeah, that's why I'm appearing from a bedroom in my house. However, Tyler Radabaugh is wave Tyler is is at the museum, and behind him in the background, you may at some point see Holly Hunter, um, who is the executive employee for the museum. First slide, if you would, Greg. So one of the questions I'm always interested in is, what do you find when you go into a museum? What's going to be on the shelves? And if you come to the Middlesex County Museum in Saluda, one of the things you'll find is you will find some military history. You'll find some information about archaeology. You will find maps that say something about the way this area has changed. You'll find a small collection of books that we use. You'll find some information on genealogy about families, among many other things. But one of the things that you will find in the museum is you will find some old pieces of glass. And what you see now on the screen are some of the colonial pieces of glass that we have. Many of them thanks to a local collector, Stan Dameron, who has made some pieces available to the museum. One of the things about colonial glass is that you can generally get some sense of how they were made by a glass blower. That is, things seem to be three-dimensional. They're not flat bottles, but they're things that could have begun with glass blowing. And they're not a lot of them. Often they're in broken pieces. But so we have some of those, but what we have much more of, and many museums of our size has much more, are of glassware. Next slide. That is the product of work from the period basically between the Civil War and the 1960s. And so we've got a good collection of those things, bottles for milk, for soda, for medicine, even a few bottles that we use for shoe polish and face powder kinds of things. But the museum has actually two sections which have bottles. What you're seeing on the screen are the bottles that are found in which the labels are no longer attached and there's no contents. There's another section where we have bottles that either are in their original boxes or have the labels still on them. So we've got two collections. And one question someone logically might ask is, where did they come from? Who gave us those bottles? And the answer is collectors have often either loaned or given them to the museum. And collectors found them in all sorts of interesting places, beginning with their own houses. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see that what you see in this collection are 13 bottles, of which 12 were found in a single house when it was renovated in the year 2000. And so this is a house that's been in Middlesex for some time. And when the owner crawled under the house to draw extra electrical lines and repaired walls that had been broken and dug around the foundation to shore up the foundation, these were the full bottles that were there. Surprisingly, a number of them were simply hidden in the walls, so that when plaster came down for repair, you could look through and find them. Virtually anybody who looks in an old house or in the yard will find bottles of this sort. This collection is primarily, though not entirely, of patent medicine from the period from maybe 1880 to 1920. If you sort of track the construction methods, you can figure that out. So things were given to the museum by collectors who found them often in their own property and in some occasions in other people's property who had given them permission to search for that. And they are, if you will, part of our local cultural history. The next slide is of not of bottles, but I want to take a side trip, and that is to say, I want to talk about the important role of amateur collectors and preservationists. Amateur is, of course, from the Latin word amador, which means lovers, and people see things that catch their fancy and they collect them. And there are often historical moments when they do that. That is, they collect things when they sense that they're becoming more rare. So if there are not a lot, if things that were once numerous are becoming less numerous, usually the first people to notice that are local collectors. I think of in my childhood when the new design for Lincoln pennies came out in 1960. It only took a year or two for me, to recognize as an elementary school student that the old ones were getting more rare and you didn't see them as much when you got change from the store. And people all across America started putting aside those pennies. And I suppose has something to do with why America's always short of pennies. Because people began to notice they were going out of use. And in some ways, I think amateur collectors and preservationists are the front line of cultural history and anthropology, because they generally notice first what's going out of use, and then 40 years later, a historian or anthropologist comes around and talks about the things that they have preserved and the cultural shift involved. The picture I have up is from the collection of a man whose name was R.J. Gettens. Gettens lived almost all his whole life between New York State, upper New York State, and Virginia, and was by occupation a preservationist in art museums. So he had some ability about how you maintain paintings and other items in art museums that need preservation. But his love, which was evident to anybody who went to his house, was the result of his years in the Army during World War II when he was sent to New Mexico. He had just gotten out of Harvard, and the Army thought he was smart, and he got sent out where they were working on the creation of the atomic bomb, if you've seen the Oppenheimer movie. And in his time off, when he had it, he visited local shops and areas and started collecting for himself without any academic background in the area, started collecting baskets and pottery that were typical of New Mexico and available for sale at that point. And this, so most of his collection starts in 1943, and he kept these for his whole life, and then he passed them on to his daughter. And about 2015, when his daughter died childless, that collection was then according to the terms of the will, was given away as gifts to different facilities. So if you go to there is a museum of Pueblo culture, Center for Pueblo Culture in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And one of the elements of their collection are those pots and baskets that were collected by R.J. Gettens in his, he wasn't a formal scholar of them, but he was an amateur who loved that. And his work now is part of the story of, who are the Pueblo Indians, and some of the things that people were making for sale and did not retain copies of now are returned. And other of his baskets are in Alaska, in museums in Alaska, and there's some in museums in California, so that what he collected in an amateur way went on to be very helpful in a more formal museum collection. So I would like to look at the next slide. Oh, and I want to, the next slide is some local bottles. Tyler's going to talk to us about them a little bit, but not yet, because I have some, I've got a comment to go on in, and it's about why it is that bottles begin to be the numerous after the Civil War and less numerous after 1960. So the reason they became more numerous after the Civil War was there was a big step forward in technology. Glass to that time was largely the work of craftsmen, of glass blowers, who made bottles and other glass items. But after the Civil War, increasingly the production of bottles was mechanized. And it was one of the ways that you can tell an old bottle from a new one is a new bottle or a post-Civil War bottle generally has a seam down both sides or is embossed. That is, it has raised letters. You can't do embossing with glass blowing. And the lines down the side are lines of indication that there was a mold, that people, poured the glass in a mold and then joined together the sides of the mold, and it leaves a line. So that process was more successful than or produce more bottles in a more rapid way. And so suddenly there was a possibility of getting a larger quantity of bottles that you could use. In about 1848, the telegraph crossed the United States for the first time and made it possible to communicate nationwide, and also possible to create, in effect, a national market for items. And of course, the Transcontinental Railway is another link. Transportation and communication got better. And so you could sell items, put them in jars, which you now could afford, and sell them to people at a greater distance. So bottles become much more numerous. So fast forward, why did they become less numerous after 1960? Number one, probably most important, the expansion of the use of plastic. Things that used to be in glass bottles suddenly were being sold in plastic bottles. And that cuts down the number of things available. Secondly, in terms of simply finding what was used, prior to 1960, most places allowed people to burn their trash in their own yard. And if you did that or remember or have talked to people who did that, often when you finish with burning everything up, the bottles amazingly survived. And if you buried your trash, at some point buried those ashes, you were also putting bottles into the ground. And so there was uh, by 1960, cities and then towns and other municipalities began to ban the burning of trash in people's individual yards. And so that custom went down. And finally, after 1960, there was a increase in attempts to recycle. And so glass was being recycled as it had been in the colonial era. Back when glass was very expensive, glass was melted down and reused. And that's another reason why there are not a lot of colonial bottles around, because the glass went on to be used again in many cases. So you've got glass becomes less available. And by the 1960s, people started noticing that the bottles they remembered as children weren't around anymore and started picking them up. And so in the United States, the invention, the creation of societies of bottle preservers or bottle diggers um, began to grow. And the national organization, at the end of this talk, I'll mention that group by name, and local bottle groups like there is in the Richmond area or in the Shenandoah Valley began to appear around the 60s. So again, kind of first response, we notice something's happening. The bottles are disappearing. And while that's not showing up in graduate school classrooms, people are looking on the ground and are looking at the stores and are noticing that they're no longer getting milk delivered to their back door, and begin to pick that up. So the modern effort at bottle collecting starts in serious way in the 1960s. And the next slide is going to be, we've got a question, and that is, where were the bottles that we find now in Middlesex? Where were they made? And how local were they? And Tyler's going to help us out with that, I hope. Tell us what these pictures are and what they indicate.
Yep. So you'll actually see on the left here the Deltaville bottle. So the Deltaville Bottling Works was part of Ed Bristow's enterprises down near the intersection of Horseshoe Bend Road and Route 33 in Deltaville. And that was the first bottling plant in Middlesex County. So I think that it operated pre-1916 because of its lack of appearance on a 1916-17 business directory for Middlesex County. But by that year, we see the bottling plant open in Lot, which is the name of Hartfield. So the name from Hartfield changed probably in the late 30s or early 40s from Lot to actually Hartfield in honor of one of the general merchants there. And then you see in the mid 20s, the Urbana Coke plant being built, which was in operation until I believe the early 60s, but I'd have to check on that. But the Sentinel was gracious enough to let us use this photo of one of the workers bottling orange crass in the Urbana Coke plant.
And the next slide, I think, is one of the, gives you a picture of.
Yep, and it's also interesting to note that this building was also one of the early funeral homes of the area. So he was quite the entrepreneur that was able to operate all these businesses out of this one building.
So, both bottles and funerals. Interesting combination.
Yeah.
I know often one of the things people used to do was sometimes funeral homes and cabinet makers overlapped in the 19th century because the people made their own caskets.
Yep.
And and a few chairs on the side or something. And so you would have the Clore family in Madison County, Virginia, has they sell chairs, and the next county over there's a Clore funeral home in Culpeper. So there's often overlapping connections of things. I'd like to look at the next two bottles, and have you got something else to add about the manufacture in the area? So the next slide is of two different, just two different bottles we have in our collection. One is a Raleigh bottle on the left, and the other one is for Grove's chill medicine. Yeah, Grove's tasteless chill tonic. Um, and one of the questions is, of course, how did they get here? The ones that weren't made in Middlesex, because while you find a lot of Middlesex bottles, you find a lot of things that weren't made here. The Raleigh bottle company, they had Raleigh's tonic. They had their own corps of door-to-door salesmen, and they called them the Raleigh's men. And they went all over the United States, and they would show up and offer their product, not at the general store, but in somebody's, knock on the door. And I guess they tended to promote the medicine as good for what ails you, and they would go from one place to another as they shared their items. The chill tonic is interesting because it's from St. Louis, but it's a bottle that was found in Locust Hill. So clearly, some other people are shipping through the mail, either to individuals or pharmacies, to make it possible to get medicine from any place in the country and have it arrive right here in Middlesex, so that people in Middlesex can enjoy it as its wonderful benefits. But one of the questions that sort of a more obvious question, I guess, is what was in the bottles? What was the actual contents of these bottles? And in some ways, some things are clear. The milk bottles had milk in them. The few wine and beer bottles we had wine and beer in them. And the soda bottles had soda in them. And then the medicine bottles had medicine in them. It's kind of logical. It is interesting that the soda bottles and the medicine bottles have overlapping histories. Because much early 19th century soda was often sold for having medicinal purposes. And so if you think in the 1880s, the three big giants that were produced in 1893, 1885, 1886, Coke, Pepsi, and Dr. Pepper were all produced by pharmacists who came up with the formula and began to put them in sale. And they had some suspicious kind of ingredients in them at that point. Coca-Cola had cocaine in it in its early, as a controlled substance that you and you got it in the pharmacy. Maybe others remember this, but as a child, I think my doctor used to prescribe Coca-Cola syrup as a way to deal with a cough instead of getting somebody else's cough syrup. But so they had some of that medicinal idea carried on all the way into the 1950s. Any case, they had there's some question, though, they didn't actually say on the label of most of the things what was in them. But we do have some idea, because by the 1890s, their pharmacy schools began to take notice and try to to publish volumes that explain what was inside these containers. And so a guy named A. Emil Hess, for example, produced a thesaurus of proprietary preparations that had a long listing of the ingredients of better known things insofar as they were known, and then listings of categories of things. And you can find his book online. I mean, it is available among other places. Well, you can find it if you search under the name of E. Emil Hiss. thesaurus of propriety preparations. But it's kind of interesting. What it reveals, if you go through the book, is most of these things had sugar, alcohol, and water in them as key ingredients. So, for example, I looked up to see there was a medicine called Cook's electromagnetic liniment. That name is important for Middlesex County, as I'll suggest later. And here is what was in the liniment. If you had a amount of the liniment, it had 1 ounce of soap, 2 ounces of ox gall, 4 ounces of camphor, 6 ounces of ammonia water, 4 ounces of oil of amber, and 64 fluid ounces of alcohol. So it was largely alcohol, but it had some extra, if you will, ingredients that were added to it. So occasionally, so I think if you look back, you can put the medicines in 3 categories. Some of them were relatively harmless and didn't do anything except make alcohol available. Some of them had the danger of doing actual harm, and some of them actually did something that was good. So if you remember Grove's tasteless chill tonic, it was prescribed for malaria. Its major ingredient was quinine, which is a tree in Latin America whose essence is used still today as one of the ingredients in treating people with malaria. So it actually was something one can think of in terms of bottles of getting aspirin, which turns out to this day to have all sorts of wonderful properties. So some things were good. It probably was not good that Coca-Cola had cocaine in it, though it maybe helped the sales because people would get addicted to Coca-Cola because of its early use of cocaine. So there were things you probably wouldn't want in your medicines. Some things that were good. Interestingly, the name patent medicine is something of a misnomer because patent medicines weren't patented by and large. What was patented was the name of patent medicines. So all that the government guaranteed was that, if I claim to have Bob's pig grass ointment for colds, the government would make sure that nobody else could sell something under that same title. But they wouldn't guarantee that the pig grass did anything that actually was related or that there was even pig grass in it. The patent was a patent of a name, and somebody could not use that identical name. So it was more like a copyright, if you will, in most cases than patents. And the government before 1906 did not guarantee that anything in the bottle would actually help you, or that it was what people said. So next slide. I don't know if anybody in high school had to read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which was about the meatpacking industry in Chicago. But it came out in 1906 and created a great stir about people who were afraid that the food they were eating was absolutely terrible for them. And it spurred a concern about the quality of foods and other materials that people were getting in this country. And one of the things that they did at the same time was the passage of an omnibus act that wasn't just the Food Act, but was the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. And this is a cover from whose weekly? Let's see, from Collier's Weekly, Collier's Weekly magazine cover. And if you look at it closely, you can see that the skull the teeth of the skull are bottles of patent medicine. And this was a cover to a story about the dangers of believing that what patent medicines did what claimed to do was actually done. And so it starts a long government process of trying to guarantee what was in those bottles and their safety. And you know that's an ongoing matter. If some people may remember that it wasn't until the 1960s that the Food and Drug Administration made Carter stop selling Carter's little liver pills, which didn't have liver in them and they weren't good for your liver. And so they continued to sell them for a while as Carter's pills without any claim for what they did. But that didn't turn out to be an effective strategy. And so Carter's pills disappeared. And so slowly, beginning in 1960, if you will, the federal government began to limit the claims that were being made by people who had sold patent medicines and made claims for the wonderful things patent medicines did or might not have done. And so if you, Greg, if you give us the next slide. So I want to tell the story just of two medicines that have a connection to Middlesex County in general. I mean, to Middlesex County and to Virginia more broadly. And one of them are the products that came from that were sold by Kilmer. And there are actually three Kilmers who are involved. One is the Kilmer who was a doctor, and one was his brother, and one was his nephew. And Kilmer, the nephew, was the one who was probably the sharpest in sales. By the 1890s, they had 18 different medicines that they sold with all sorts of popular names. So we've got his swamp root kidney, liver, and bladder cure. And this is our bottle from the section of the museum where we have the where we've got bottles that still have something in them and still have their labels on top, kind of a pharmacy general store looking arrangement in the museum. But they were smart people and they made lots of money, particularly the third generation, or the son, who was Willis Sharp Kilmer. And he saw the handwriting on the wall after 1906. He was a very smart salesman and businessman, and so he started to diversify. And one of the things he did was he originally started going into construction. So some of the money that was made from swamp root was then used to build buildings in Bingham, New York. And then he decided that he was going to diversify in another way, and he moved to Virginia and bought farms in near Newmarket in the Shenandoah Valley and also in Middlesex. And so he has Middlesex, his Middlesex collection was in a farm, which was the Kilmer Farm, where he raised racehorses. And he couldn't convince the post office to create a Kilmer post office, so it became Remlick, which is Kilmer spelled backwards. And Tyler, we've got a picture of his racehorse in the...
Yes, we do have a photo of Exterminator, his famous racehorse. I know that several other horses that were trained at his farm in Newmarket and here in Middlesex reached some level of fame. I don't have the specifics on all of their accolades, but it's definitely something worth looking into.
And then I think Exterminator, what was it?
Yep, Exterminator.
Went on to win the Kentucky Derby. Is he?
Yep.
So that he, you know, Kilmer had a green thumb. He projects that he works in a variety of different ways seemed to meet with considerable success. As far as I can tell, the production of the Dr. Kilmer's medicines remained in New York, but you can find the bottles were sold through his locations. And so I noticed when talking with members of the bottle club that is in the Shenandoah Valley that they find lots of Kilmer's bottles there, and of course we find them in Middlesex as well. So they're all over the place, and they have uh, quite an extension where they were sold. There's one other there are two other people who were involved in Middlesex County who actually were producing and selling in Middlesex County. And Greg, if you can show us one of the Daniel slides. So the Daniel family is a family that's been in Virginia, in Middlesex, since colonial times, since the 17th century, and I can't pretend to understand the relationship of all the Daniels, but the group of the Daniel family that lived in what is now Locust Hill was one that ventured into lots of areas, including the sale of patent medicines. The Daniels ran a store, and the Daniels members of the family, at least four different members of the family, served as postmasters or postmistresses between the Civil War and about 1920, probably having a post office in their local store. And by the 1890s, they began to advertise and sell items from their, they began to sell patent medicines as well. And so we don't have any bottles of this. If you find any bottles that say J. William Daniel on it, we would love to have some copies. But what we do have are advertisements. So we know that they were being sold, and they show up in the local area. And just one thought, Tyler, their farm was on what is now No Head Bottom Road, or their store. Do you have a story about why it's called No Head?
I do. So in the 50s, there was a report on kind of the urban legend that started it. It was supposedly linked back to a ghost story of a lady that was seen. I don't know if she was headless or some type of mutilating injury that was definitely jarring for the traveling person. And then he just shared the story, and eventually, as they named the post office, it became No Head.
And that it had the name already by the 1890s. So it must
Right.
be, yeah. So it's a story been around. So yeah, if you go by the middle school in Middlesex County, go down Puller Highway, we come to an intersection right where the middle school is, and if you if you go toward the river, if you at that point go north, you will be on No Head Bottom Road, and their address, the Daniel address, around 1900 was No Head Farm. So that was the area in which that may have been another example of promotion ability, creating something of interest. But if you I am confused because there are actually three different people named J. William Daniel in the family, probably four between 1880 and 1920. So one of them is, at least one is named John William Daniel, and one is named James William Daniel. So there are, so the bottle says J. William Daniel. So I can't be in 100% certain how many people are producing it. But they, multiple members of the Daniel family, were pretty smart in promotion, and they looked at trends in selling medicines before they chose the name for their primary product. One of them was that people were starting to add electric or magnetic to the names of their fluid, though in fact, in most cases, there was absolutely nothing electric or magnetic about their elixir. Pre-1906, they just thought that sounded good. This is and so Havens, you'll see, was one of the first people who combined the two. And so it wasn't just an electric, it was an electromagnetic. So that was pretty exciting. And there was a veterinarian and I'm not sure whether it was the New York City area or in Massachusetts, because I can't read the fine print on the sign, but who came up and had all sorts of animal preparations. He was a Dr. Daniels with an S, who sold things, liniments and other things for the use of your animals. And so J. William Daniel decided, he could use his own name. He didn't claim to be a doctor or a vet on the label, and he picked up electromagnetic. And so if you look at the ad, suddenly they were selling a liniment, which could be used for a man or beast, for human beings or for animals, and claimed all sorts of wonderful things that it was intended to do. And whereas it cost, at least at the Daniel store, it cost 35 cents for a bottle of Kilmer's swamp root potion, it only costs 25 cents to get the Daniel product. And so he was selling it in as far away as Fredericksburg through the mail, which was easy if you were a postmaster, I suppose, and was advertising it in Lancaster County as well as other areas in Virginia. And so he began selling this. And at the same time, one member of the family, might have been probably the same one, became popular enough that he ran for a legislature and became the delegate from Middlesex County and Matthews in about 1914 and 1916 in the state legislature. He made a mistake in the way he registered for the next election and was disqualified, and someone else was elected. I think he did his paperwork in Middlesex, but not in Matthews, and therefore there's an exchange with the state attorney general that he was not allowed to run for re-election. But anyway, kind of a wonderful effort at trying to come up with medicine, which probably was mostly alcohol, and probably was not, didn't do most of the things that he claimed that it would do. Next slide is something that we know even less about, that Tyler and I know even less about than we do about Daniels, who also seemed to have some. What was the other thing that Daniel was selling in that ad, Tyler? He was selling
stock and poultry powders.
Yes. Okay. So some powders to put on your animals, or so he didn't just do liquids. He was riding on the reputation of the veterinarian, Dr. Daniels, and offering different things. There was also a purveyor of patent medicine who created the Great American Vegetable Remedy. And those bottles are marked with Saluda as the location in which they were sold. And if anybody knows anything more about Dr. Hewitt's, the medicine was not widely circulated enough to show up in the some of the catalogs of bottles. So I've not found anybody yet who, he's not in the pharmacy guides of the 1890s, as far as I can tell. The last slide is just to talk about kind of a bounce back. Patent medicines were on the decline because of government regulation after the Food and Drug Act of 1906, but they did have a rebound in this country during the years of Prohibition because they had lots of alcohol to them. And I corresponded at one point with a man in Colorado who's written a book I'll show you shortly about bottles. And he pointed out that the amounts of bottles of patent medicine you find in areas where there was a strong Mormon population seemed to be higher than some other places because the Mormons made a point of not drinking. And so maybe that's why I found some bottles in the wall. Maybe people were trying to put them out of sight and not make it clear they'd been having much of their they've been drinking a little more medicine maybe than they needed. I believe it's Larry Tuning who tells the story that during Prohibition that there was up until rather recently it was possible to take a ride on a ship from Irvington to a good-sized ship from Irvington to Urbana. And I believe it may be in Signatures in Time or in one of the articles that appeared in the Southside Sentinel, was a discussion of the fact that one of the reasons people took that trip from Irvington was the Marshall's Drugstore in Urbana had a better stock of patent medicines at that particular point. And I don't think if Larry has signed on this talk, he can correct me. But across the country, there was for a while a kind of boost in patent medicines. So final slide, and then we'll have some time for questions. There are a number of organizations of bottle collectors, and one of them is the Greater Richmond Bottle Collection Group. And it has, I'm going to change my screen and see if I can read it myself better. Failed. Hang on just for a second while I get this. Okay. So there is a show from the Richmond area bottle collectors, which is going to be on October 5th. They're going to be at the Chesterfield County Fairgrounds. And if you would like to go and see people who are exchanging bottles there, there is if you'd like to buy bottles, see bottles, compare collections, that'll be general public at 9 o'clock and early buyers at 7:30 if you want to come in and do some trading in bottles there. There is also another group called the Historical Bottle Diggers of Virginia that have a Facebook page, and often bottle organizations will have pictures of bottles they had. Sometimes they will have a place where you can buy things online, making that possible to see what's up. And there's a big organization, the national organization, which is called the Federation of Historical Bottle Collectors. And that group has a marvelous webpage. They have a virtual museum in which you can look at pictures. You have the kind of sense you're going through a museum. They have connections to all kinds of resources. And they also have connections to some works that are by Bill Agee, who in the 60s and early 70s published a big list of bottles, particularly of patent medicines. And then to the right is the Richard Fikes book, the bottle book, which is one of the better collections of books about bottles. And it came out in editions in 1987, and then a new edition with 2006, which had corrections and additions in the back. But if you found bottles or you're just interested in them, those are all resources that would give you a chance to look and see. And in what we've said about Middlesex County having local bottles connected, produced, things packaged and sold, is also true of the surrounding counties, and therefore I assume much of Virginia. So I spoke with one of the organizers of the Richmond area bottle collectors shows, who said that he had or had seen bottles from Matthew, Essex County, and Lancaster County. So if our group of counties has got um, local bottles, they're going to be local bottles from those places as well. And I am open for questions and comments and for corrections from people who probably know a lot more about bottles than I do. And if you are, Greg, what do we have to do about muting or unmuting?
Yeah, so it should be where everybody can unmute themselves. Maybe just use the raise your hand, or if you're on camera, raise your, physical hand, and go ahead and unmute and ask your question. I noticed that Gary, you unmuted. Why don't you go first?
Yeah. I have a question. Gary Cook from Hartfield. The Deltaville Bottle Works and the Urbana Bottling, Coke Bottling Company, did they actually make the bottles there, or were they made elsewhere and literally the product was just bottled there at that point?
So, Tyler, do you know more of the answer than I do?
I would say that they were made there, but if there's, take it away, Bob.
My impression generally is that bottles were made locally early on. I'm sure that there was greater concentration as time went on. But what the companies originally did was they provided the syrup, and the local people provided the carbonation, the water in the bottle. And so and they worked out sort of favorable contracts for those local folk. And so I noticed, for example, that the family that owned the Virginia bottling, or one of the big franchises for bottling Coca-Cola, that family has gone on to be a major charitable giver in Virginia. So they seem to have done well in the product. But like the pharmacy, they shipped out the syrup, and people got bottles. And I would guess initially they were all local, and then over time, the bigger ones ate up the smaller bottle companies, because the bottle company in Deltaville ceased to exist. So somebody else was making the bottles at that point.
Okay. Second question is there any way to date the bottles? Does the embossing change with year, like a model car? The models change and there's features that you can use to date it? Or are they only in a very broad range of maybe decades?
There is a nice there's a nice essay at the beginning of the bottle book about bottles. But what I understand is this. Of course, the big tell is a seam down the side that tells you that it's made, or embossing. Either one of those means it's a modern production, not glass blown. And then there is the people look at the neck, because the process of adding the neck onto the bottle is one that develops over time. And if you have a very flat neck, flat top, that's often indication that it's an earlier bottle. And then the question is, at some point they begin to polish the neck in such a way that that was the one place you couldn't see the seam any longer. And so and I may have this backwards, but I think if you can't see the seam, it's newer than if you can see the seam. And over decades, there is a declaration. I mean, there is a indication of the change in profile of the neck. Of course, they go from being corked to then it's another big break is when they come up with screw-on caps. So you clearly something different has happened. The other way to tell the age, of course, is if you look at the bottle book, often they will tell you what years a bottle was produced. So it can't be earlier than the earliest production, and it can't be newer than the last production. So if you a lot of these things start in the 1880s or 1890s and then are out of business by the 1930s. So it gives you a kind of range for patent metal bottles, medicine bottles.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good questions.
Bill, did you have a question?
No. As far as the newer soda bottles, if you're able to find caps with the bottle, that helps date them too, because the older bottle caps had actually cork liners in the cap.
Oh, I remember.
Which changed to plastic as plastics evolved in the early 60s. That's a help.
Thank you. And you're from a family that had pharmacists in it and maybe medicine. Yep.
But I don't have any of the old bottles. I had an aunt that had old bottles, but I don't know what happened to them. But one of my relatives was one of the first pharmacists in the United States back in the 1880s and wrote a book, which I have here in my bookcase. And he was friends with other pharmacists in the South. That it was an emerging profession back then in the early 1880s. And like I was speaking about earlier, Bob, I have a clock upstairs, an old clock that was an advertising clock that pharmacists used and gave to prospective customers for their pharmacy products. And the clock I have is very interesting in that it had an old black man on it whose eyes, on this clock as it ran, his eyes would move from left to right on this clock. It's an old clock, brass clock that was made in Waterbury, Connecticut in the early 1800s, I believe. I looked at the back on the patents on the back of it. And I contacted the Waterbury Clock Company back in the probably 1960s or 80s, 70s maybe. And one of their people in Connecticut told me that clock is worth in excess of $900. And that was back then. So I don't know if it's worth that or less now, but it's very interesting. It was given to me by the daughter of the founder of the company.
Thank you. That's other questions or comments?
Bob again, Gary. What makes a bottle very collectible or very valuable regarding Middlesex, aside from age?
Well, my bias, I'm an amateur bottle collector, but I'm a historian by trade and taught church history for a long time. I think the number one category that makes it interesting to us at the museum is the local connection. I mean, the bottles are sold all over the country, and I'm sure there were lots of things from other places that got here, and there were some things from here that got to other places. So, learning more, finding, a Hewitt bottle or a Daniel bottle that still has a label would be absolutely wonderful. The way they made the bottles, they put embossing on one side and they had a smooth side on the other side for adding the label. And the ones that ended up in the ground, generally the label decayed over time, but ones that were stuck in a wall had at least some chance of, or some, in the attic or something like that, are more likely to have the label still attached. So a bottle with a label. In terms of sort of absolute value, if you go into, sale value, if you go on any of the bottle club sites, you'll find that they're selling things and they're pricing things. And the original AG bottle, the AG collection book, was a price list initially. He was trying to put values on things. But for a museum, it's the fact that it actually was made. It has a mark that indicates it's made. There's some historical connection, and objects in general are more valuable if you can put them in some location so they tell a local story.
And another point, excuse me.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
And another point to that is bottles, like any other collectible item, are intrinsically more valuable simply if they have markings on them. Anything with a marking or a maker's stamp or any type of marking at all is going to be worth more than something that most likely, but not always, simply if it has marks on it.
I had somebody appraise a rug at one point, a Oriental rug, and the person was talking about the value, and then flipped it over, and somebody had written in sort of crayon or marker on the back, and he said, "Oh, that makes it more valuable," and the estimate went up because you could trace who had made it, or at least
Provenance, right?
Yeah, the provenance was there and just in the back. So something that has a mark on it, something that is traceable, and sometimes they will have they will have in the bottom a mark to tell you who made it, and then embossing on one side that may tell you what the product was that was inside. So you get both information on both things. Well, thank you all for joining me today. I encourage you to keep an eye out for other offerings related to Middlesex County Museum. We do occasional things on Zoom like this one. We do other things in person. And I thank you for joining in and adding to the conversation today. And I'm just going to check one thing before I disappear. Meryl, are you on the line at this point? Do we have anything that we're in a position to announce that's upcoming? I guess.
Yeah, I was gonna say we could keep an eye on the website. How's that?
Yes, keep an
The
eye on
website. We post on their website upcoming events that are tied to the museum. Other than that, primarily we put out things in the newsletter. So if you're not subscribed to the newsletter, there's the way to subscribe on our main page, and then we use like Facebook and some of the social medias to put out some of the other events as they happen and updates to those as they come out.
And
Bob, thank you so much. This was
thank
really,
you so much, and
thank you.
Tyler,
Now you guys all see me. Thank you so much, Bob. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
thank you all.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Goodbye.
Okay, thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Thank you.